The decade after the First World War, often called the Roaring Twenties, is a legendary but often misunderstood period in American history.
It's told as if it's almost a morality play. Everyone's dancing to Charleston, and they're listening to radio, and they're buying from department stores and drinking bathtub gin. And then the stock market crashes and the Great Depression comes, as if that's some kind of punishment for too much fun in the 1920s.
Fitzgerald called it the world's most expensive orgy. And I think that that really sort of typifies the image.
But the 1920s are also a time of transition in American cultural life.
The U.S. is almost evenly split between urban and rural Americans. There are still lots of immigrants in the United States, and all kinds of questions about cultural and ethnic diversity and what kind of society America would be.
And for a long time, historians pretty much use World War I as the sort of explanation for what follows, the sense of Americans retreating into private pleasures because they were disillusioned with the experience of World War I. But I think now we have a much more sophisticated sense of the importance of World War I. We can look to long-standing changes that were transforming American culture for decades: industrialization, the creation of an urban America.
After a brief recession at the end of the war, the country launches upon a long period of prosperity and economic expansion, generated in part by Europe's weakened industrial base.
With the end of the war, the United States became the world's creditor nation. It was the only safe place in the world to really invest capital. If the stock market is shooting up and there are great boom times and there are lots of jobs being created, then suddenly people don't feel that there's a lot of need for government regulation, and people have a great deal of faith that the market will work things out all by itself and that there will be trickle down from the rich to the poor. And there seems to be some truth to this because standards of living rise, wages rise, unless of course you happen to be a farmer.
Technological breakthroughs energize the country's economic growth.
It was no longer a secret about how you could produce more wheat, how you could produce more pork, or more automobiles, or refrigerators, or more petroleum. The real issue was, were you going to be able to generate the purchasing power in order to be able to consume what the society could now produce? And in the 1920s, you do see the emergence for the first time of these more consumer-oriented industries, like the automobile, like the motion picture industry, the radio industry, and of course even things like the infant airline industry. The old industrial base, coal mining, railroads, steel, and certainly agriculture as well. Those old industries are, in a sense, beginning to enter into periods of decline, periods of stagnation.
There is a dramatic shift in the employment structure in these new mass-production industries, and a division of labor that creates a clear demarcation between white-collar and blue-collar workers.
White-collar workers who are part of what we call a managerial revolution are really experiencing a tremendous sense of optimism and a sense of prosperity. But it comes at a certain amount of cost. In some ways, you can even say that white-collar workers are experiencing some of what blue-collar workers have experienced working for large corporations and less autonomy over the workplace, although white-collar workers are far more prosperous. The businessman had become the cult hero of the 1920s. It seemed as business's reputation rose during the 1920s, organized laborers suffered.
Certainly there was an eagerness on the part of many of the workers to form labor unions, but the only existing national labor organization was what was called the American Federation of Labor, and they were organized not according to industry, but according to specific crafts. To a large extent, they looked down upon the ordinary mass production worker.
There's a relatively high standard of living for blue-collar workers who are at the top of their fields. They're able to buy homes. They're able to experience some of the consumer pleasures of the 1920s. But for unskilled blue-collar workers, for people who are at the bottom of the hierarchy, particularly recent immigrants, it's much more difficult.
The 500,000 African-American workers who migrated from the rural South after 1914 are in the most precarious position.
The arrival of these black workers from the South undercuts the legitimate struggle of white workers for decent living conditions and a fair share of the incredible profits of American industry. Black workers will scramble into the cities of the North, eager to take any job at any pay level, because whatever they earn is in many cases 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 times higher than what they got in the South. And they are not at all interested in unions initially.
The feeling of Samuel Gompers, who's the head of the AFL, is that we're having so much trouble being accepted as a labor organization. We don't need to add the other problem of having blacks in our organization and then having people turn against us because we're integrated. And the same thing with the white working class in manufacturing. An industry owner would hire an African American and they would walk out.
They see it as degrading for a white working man to labor alongside blacks. But many blacks don't understand the concept of the union. If you're getting good pay and the boss is letting you come to work every day, what's all this about going on strike? So blacks arrive as scabs, enraging white workers, who in many cases then begin to close their unions to them and in fact attack them and riot against them as people who are lowering their standard of living.
And they still try to struggle to get some access to industrial work, but it's not as great as other groups, as immigrant groups, for example.
That doesn't, of course, mean that there aren't jobs for black men and women. Black women tend in huge numbers to work as domestic servants, sometimes in the homes of the very women who are going out to work in the factories. But the jobs that are available for black women in factories tend to be relatively low-level jobs in domestic services, in laundries, in janitorial services of various kinds. Now, those are generalizations. There are significant numbers of African American teachers. There are significant numbers of black nurses. There are significant numbers of African American women running their own enterprises of various kinds. But the truth is that the opportunities available to them are limited.
Across racial categories, numbers of women are now working outside the home.
At the time, people were convinced that there had been an absolute revolution. They talk about women just flooding into all manners of occupations. And they also claim that this is creating this tremendous moral revolution because women are so free. Well, that's really a good example of the stereotypes in the 1920s. The change comes about 1910, not 1920. There are different kinds of ways of looking at women's opportunities in the 1920s. Because of the managerial revolution, there's a tremendous demand for white-collar working women to do all the paper pushing that you have to have when you have a white-collar workforce. And this opens up opportunities for the daughters of white middle-class Americans who in the past would not have wanted to do factory work.
Black women, however, rarely enjoy such opportunities.
When clerical work made its transformation from being men's work to women's work, in the city of Washington, D.C., there were 2 African-American clerical workers. 2. I mean, it's obscene, but that's the way it was.
There still continues to be an important arena for second-generation immigrant daughters who are involved in factory work. In addition, a lot of women are involved in agricultural labor. This is particularly true of African American women.
Agriculture is engaged in a technological revolution of its own. But the plight of the American farmer, which had been so promising during the war, begins a steep downward plunge.
When foreign agriculture had recovered from the crisis of World War I, American farmers suddenly are confronted with competition, and they have overexpanded their production dramatically. They've planted every available square foot to try and take advantage of the bullish market of the World War I years.
If you were raising wheat and, say, cattle, you were competing against those who were doing the very same thing in Argentina, in Eastern Europe, and Western Europe. So suddenly American farmers found themselves struggling. The returns they received kept going down in the decade relative to their fixed cost.
And this is the beginning of the great decline in farm prices and farm incomes that made the 20s a very difficult decade for American farmers.
And yet, it isn't the image of an impoverished farmer that receives the most attention in the 20s. It is the consumer, the flapper, and a host of actors, artists, and writers that seem to dominate the scene.
All you have to do is think about Victorian houses and all the stuff that middle-class Americans tried to stuff into their homes to understand that Americans were pretty materialistic in the period before the 1920s. But there's something really quite remarkable about the consumer explosion in the 20s, and particularly if you use the car as something that transforms daily life in a really dramatic way. More and more homes are becoming electrified in the 1920s, which ties into the consumer revolution.
Movies now have sound. The first radio network is formed, and stations across the country are broadcasting a great variety of programming. The literary achievements of the 1920s, many critics believe, are unparalleled in American history. Some artists bring their own culture and origins into focus.
African-American artists and writers who clustered in Harlem and were involved in creating all sorts of artistic forms were very self-conscious of the fact that they were trying to create a distinctive black American art. So they would, jokingly ask each other, how's the Renaissance going? And I think that's a good example of just how exciting and vibrant it was to be an African-American artist in this enclave of Harlem.
It was poetry, art, and music and other things which had a political cast. So it was a strange fusion of a political moment of disillusionment and anger with a moment of great hope and efflorescence of artistic life, and the emergence of Harlem as a thriving urban center for educated black men and women.
The secular culture that emerges in the 1920s coexists, not entirely comfortably, with an older, more provincial, and often less affluent culture that views this new era as a threat to their way of life. The failure of Prohibition, the alignment of the Ku Klux Klan with nativist sympathizers, and the rise of religious fundamentalism attest to their degree of discomfort.
Well, Prohibition could not be enforced. It's impossible. The fact that it was so widely violated really indicates why the law was passed to begin with. The fear that there were people in America who really were not accepting traditional Protestant notions about restraint, about sobriety. And so the law becomes this kind of symbolic statement of the maintenance of certain kinds of notions about whose values dominate in American culture.
Perhaps no issue points out the divisions that exist in the country more clearly than the debate regarding immigration.
America, relative to other countries, had a remarkably open and welcoming system of immigration. Great need for labor, great confidence in the assimilation power of American institutions, and that great confidence is gone after World War I. There were a lot of native-born Americans who had difficulty getting jobs. So a changing economic situation is part of the story. Another part is how people deal with diversity under difficult conditions. There have been times in America when diversity has been a source of fear that immigrants would not be loyal to America, that they did not have the character to become good American citizens. And part of the conclusion that many Americans come to in World War I is that there had been too much strife on the home front, and thus it was time to call a suspension of the great experiment of the melting pot, at least until America could assimilate some more people. What made this episode so damaging was the justification for closing the gates, which was made on racial terms.
The number of newcomers who could come annually was based on the population that was here already in 1890, and it would be 2% of that population. Well, if you look back at those who settled colonial America and then into the mid-19th century, were primarily those from the northwest of Europe, England, Germany, Scotland, Ireland. In 1890, the Italians were just starting to come, the Poles, the Slovenians, the Russian Jews, and so forth. So if you only take 2% of that population, it effectively keeps that quota at a minimum.
The battle over immigration restriction brings together some unlikely co-conspirators.
At the forefront of the call for immigration restriction are the obviously bigoted organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. But it wouldn't have passed if it were just extremist. There's a strong support on the part of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans to restrict immigration, to try to maintain their own status, power, and influence in American culture by excluding people from Southern and Eastern Europe or excluding Asian Americans.
The Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s is not the same Klan that terrorized Southern blacks during Reconstruction.
For one thing, it's not just focused in the South. It's all over the country. And its target isn't African Americans exclusively, which was the case in the Reconstruction period, but rather the Klan was kind of an equal opportunity bigot. It had a kind of list of people who seemed to be dangerous to American society. So this included a strong hostility to immigrants, especially Eastern and Southern Europeans, but also Asian and Mexican immigrants. The Klan was exceptionally hostile to Catholics and to Jews.
There are stories of night riders terrorizing Armenian grape pickers in California, and there were cause célèbre, a case of a lynching of 11 Italians in New Orleans. And as you go back through the history of lynching, I mean, it's surprising to discover how many immigrants were lynched. Nothing like the numbers of blacks. And one of the things that makes this history so difficult and complex is that no matter how much a pariah a given group was, or how much they were thought to be inferior, they still were being let in the country on the basis of being free white persons.
So the Klan of the 20s is focused on a sense that there is an ethnic, a racial, a religious threat to the homogeneity of American culture. And there's this perception that these outsiders, as white Anglo-Saxon Protestants viewed them, were dangerous. It used to be said that the Klan was really about small-town America being upset about the rise of urban America. There's some truth to that, but one of the most interesting things to me about the Klan of the 1920s is some of the strongest Klan locations were in the cities themselves.
Another source of conflict in the 1920s centers on the role of religion in contemporary society. Fundamentalists are outraged by the fact that modernists abandon traditional beliefs in their acceptance of scientific theories.
The question of religion in the 1920s, I think, is particularly interesting because on the one hand you have this image of Americans all involved in consumerism, materialism, this sort of false image of the party decade. But on the other hand, there's a lot of evidence that Americans took religion very seriously. One of the most obvious examples is the Scopes trial of 1925, which is over whether or not evolution can be taught in the public schools. And it becomes an extraordinary media event when the trial takes place in Tennessee. In the past, historians used to say that the Scopes trial was a real example of the eventual sort of victory of science over religion, because even though Scopes, who was the high school teacher who was teaching evolution, lost the case, the publicity for the case made the rural fundamentalists look so, quote, ignorant, that it seemed on the surface to be a kind of defeat for very traditional religious values. But in fact, I would argue that the attention given to the Scopes trial and the nature of religious belief, how do you interpret the Bible, was such an important issue in the 1920s that it really speaks to the desire of Americans to take religion seriously.
The anguish of provincial Americans trying to defend an embattled way of life is particularly troubling for Democrats. Their constituents, urban and rural, are at odds with each other.
The Democrats didn't really find a voice, didn't find a candidate until Governor Smith in 1928. That it was really Governor Smith who was the first Democratic candidate to be able to successfully tap this new wave of urban working-class voters who would become the foundation, in many ways, of the Roosevelt coalition in the 1930s. And those two parts of the Democratic Party, sort of the urban wing The New York, Chicago, Detroit, San Francisco part of the party was sharply divided against the rural part from the South and from the Midwest.
The Republicans, however, seemed to have a secure hold on both the presidency and the Congress.
Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover in some ways get lumped together, in part because they're Republicans, in part because they seem very much less colorful and less interesting than Wilson and Roosevelt. But the other thing that's significant about the Republican presidents is that they do share political ideology that's tied into the idea that business and free enterprise should be the sort of framing point for politics.
Harding's term in office is distinguished primarily by some of the people he appoints to cabinet positions.
For all of his own, say, intellectual weaknesses, Mr. Harding appears to have had a pretty keen eye for talented individuals. So that, for example, he chose Herbert Hoover to be Secretary of Commerce. Hoover emerged from the war as probably one of the most popular and certainly one of the most highly regarded American political leaders. Harding also chose Charles Evans Hughes to be Secretary of State. And quite frankly, Hughes probably is one of the most important political, legal figures of the 20th century. He would later be Chief Justice during the 1930s.
Harding's undoing is his inability to shake off ties to those who had helped place him in office. The scandals that result make newspaper headlines.
My sense of the Teapot Dome scandal is that certainly the most serious wrongdoing was probably the relationship between the Secretary of the Interior, Mr. Fall, and Mr. Edward Doheny, who was one of the more powerful figures in the oil industry. And favors were exchanged, and as a result of certain arrangements were made for Mr. Doheny's company. And so there was obviously the sense of impropriety. Whether it was any more serious than, say, what had happened during the time of Richard Ballinger way back in the Taft administration in terms of the lease of Alaskan lands to private firms, it's hard to say. But I think he simply placed a lot of trust in people who betrayed him, and that's not an unusual thing to happen in a large organization.
Calvin Coolidge, who succeeds Harding in 1923, is very different from his predecessor. He is dour, silent, and puritanical, a contrast to Harding's more genial and garrulous personality.
Mr. Coolidge brought a heightened sense of austerity, a sense of probity and of integrity that certainly was somewhat refreshing once all of the scandals of the Harding period were laid out in the nation's press. I think certainly one of the most lasting changes that came with Mr. Coolidge was that he did bring in to his administration people like a new Attorney General, Harlan Fiske Stone, who really cleaned up some of the mess that had been left over from the Doherty years.
It is likely that Coolidge would have been re-elected in 1928, if not for the fact that he walks into the press room one day and hands each reporter a slip of paper containing a single sentence: "I do not choose to run for president in 1928. Republicans turned to Herbert Hoover as their candidate, not necessarily the favorite of party leaders.
Hoover oftentimes operated outside of the conventional Republican Party apparatus. He had his own public relations crew. He, in a sense, was a kind of solo practitioner. And so probably, if the party bosses had had absolute control of the convention in 1928, Mr. Hoover was not their first choice.
Democrats nominate New York Governor Al Smith.
The 10 or 15 largest metropolitan areas voted for the Democratic presidential candidate. This was amazing because the Republicans had dominated those metropolitan areas since the election of McKinley in 1896. Of course, Al Smith had been 3 times the governor of New York, and the fact that he was Irish, that he was Catholic, that he came from New York City was of enormous advantage in terms of being able to attract voters in these large American cities.
But Smith had little in common with the farmers of the Midwest or the South.
He could not appeal beyond this kind of urban ethnic constituency. So to a large extent, Mr. Hoover had a somewhat broader vision of the American future. There's an old essay, I think, by Richard Hofstadter in which he basically posed the question, could a Protestant have beaten Herbert Hoover? And the answer he came up with was no, that there was such a sense of economic well-being, of prosperity in November of 1928, that it is unlikely that any Democratic candidate, Franklin Roosevelt, anyone, would have been able to overcome the advantage which the Republican Party had simply because people were voting their pocketbooks, and the pocketbooks for many of them were still rather fat.
And few people anticipate the difficult years that are to come. The Unfinished Nation is a 52-part American history series. For more information about this program and accompanying materials, call 1-800-576-2988 or visit us online at www.intelecom.org.